Hello YouTube divers, this is WaterDive122 and I want to welcome you all to yet another episode of Magic Metal Mondays. And this time we are finally back to ranking a band's studio album discography from worst to best. And today we are going to tackle yet another band from the big four of thrash metal here in America. We are talking about Anthrax. Now, Anthrax, even though they're my least favorite out of the big four, I still freaking love this band. This band is amazing. And one of their albums actually made an appearance on my top 10 all-time favorite albums lists. But I'm not going to spoil that for you. You'll just have to wait until the end of the video when I reach the number one Anthrax album, yeah? Alright, so without further ado, let's get this party started. Coming in at the bottom, no surprise here, 1998's Volume 8, The Threat is Real. Now, honestly, this album is fine, I guess. But the main reason why it falls down here is because it doesn't really sound like an Anthrax album. I mean, yeah, you got, like, this cool, thrashy stuff, and in my opinion, this was just Anthrax just trying to go a little bit heavier. I mean, John Bush does an okay job on this album. Like, for example, on the song Killing Box, he does a great job. I don't really like a lot of parts on that song, but I do like the type of direction that Anthrax was going in. Now, this album definitely has its high points, but even those kind of show up a little bit far too often, and plus this album is way too long, especially given the fact that this album doesn't really have a lot of hits, in my opinion. So, yeah, there could have been a lot of material that could have been, like, cut down or just completely deleted altogether. I mean, compared to everything else that Anthrax did over the years, this album is definitely probably their worst. So, number 11, Volume 8, The Threat is Real. Now we're coming in at number 10, and this one might be a little bit of a controversial pick. We're talking about 1995's Stomp 442. Now, why did I say that this would be a controversial pick? Mainly because this album, according to a lot of Anthrax fans, they say that this album is pretty much one of their most underrated albums. I can definitely see why. It opens up greatly with the 1-2 punch of Random Acts of Senseless Violence. What an opener. And then followed that up by Fueled. Amazing. But I think on this album, especially on Random Acts of Senseless Violence, John Bush tries way too hard to sound like Joey Belladonna. And, well, I mean, the two are kind of similar if you want to put them face to face. But, yeah, I think John Bush was just trying a little bit too hard to sound like Joey Belladonna on this album. And the main reason why I put this album a little bit higher than Volume 8 was mainly because of that freaking killer 1-2 punch of Random Acts of Senseless Violence and Fueled. I mean, yeah, this is definitely a more enjoyable album compared to Volume 8, but it falls way short out of the rest of the albums that we're about to get into here. Now we're coming in at number 9, the debut album from 1984, Fistful of Metal. Now, yeah, this is definitely my least favorite Anthrax album of the 80s. This was the only album to feature vocalist Neil Turbin before he left the band and went on to do some other crap. I don't know. But I don't really like Neil Turbin's vocal abilities. This was definitely not the direction that Anthrax was trying to go in. I mean, with Joey Belladonna, it was more, it was kind of like it, but it was not nearly as aggressive screams. It was basically like operatic type of screams, kind of like Michael Kiske, of Halloween. But it's kind of hard to describe Neil Turbin. But this album has a really killer song on here, Death Rider. It's a song that you would hear Anthrax play over and over and over and over again on their live sets. It's definitely the album I enjoy on this album. No, I said album twice. I meant to say it's definitely my favorite song on the album, and kind of like the issue that I have with debut albums. It's the first album, the band's not really that good enough to do the stuff that they would later go on to do and make them so freaking famous. So with that said, this album falls here at number 9. Number 8, the 2003 album, We've Come For You All. Now, this might be a little bit of a controversial pick. It's definitely a big improvement over its predecessor, which was Volume 8. John Bush, in my opinion, sounds a lot better on this album. They really moved away from like the heavier type of vibe that they were trying to do on Volume 8 and basically like more of the aggressive tones. And this album just basically is a little bit like Volume 8 and a little bit like Stomp 442, but except it's a little bit better. I really like the production on this album, but this album is just mediocre. It's some of the songs are kind of forgettable, and yeah, I mean it's enjoyable, but compared to everything else Anthrax did, this album falls kind of short. Now we go into the Joey Belladonna era of the 2000s with 2011's Worship Music coming here at number 7. This followed up We've Come For You All, and this was the album that was recorded that was released either before or during the Big Four tour that Anthrax was on with Metallica, Megadeth, and Slayer. We all know that story. And this was actually, I believe this was the time that they replaced their guitarist, Dan Spitz. I believe that was his name. And they replaced him with Andreas Kisser from Sepultura. He does an amazing job on this album. He does an amazing job on the tour. He's got a good voice. I know he does a lot of like sing type of stuff with Anthrax. But he and Scott Ian are definitely a very, very good album in your face type of vibe. I don't know. Worship Music, definitely an improvement over We've Come For You All. But with that all being said, this album kind of falls a hair short. So without further ado, let's move on to the album that followed it. Number 6. Their most recent album, the 2016 album, For All Kings. Now, Evil Twin, freaking amazing single off of this album. And it's basically what puts this album so high. I mean, the rest of the album is average to above average to good or great or whatever the Halloween you want to call it. But with all that being said, Evil Twin definitely solidifies this as a huge comeback album for Anthrax. Now, Andreas Kisser was not featured on this album. I don't know who was their other guitarist that recorded this album with Anthrax, but he does a freaking amazing job on this album. My Evil Twin is definitely my favorite song off this album, and lots of great songs off of this freaking killer album. What a comeback for Anthrax. And if they don't release an album anytime soon, what a way to go out. So, For All Kings from 2016 coming in at number 6. And now we get into the good stuff. John Bush makes his mark here in the top 5 with 1993's Sound of White Noise. Now, first off, this album has Only, which is a freaking killer song. And if you watch the music video for Only, it is freaking amazing. You got like this cool black and white type of tone here. And then you got all the different versions of Anthrax, specifically the musicians in the band, not the, Scott Ian and Dan Spitz absolutely does an amazing absolutely do amazing jobs on here. Charlie Benante's drumming is freaking off the charts. Frank Bello's bass, definitely kicking butt. He's one of the most underrated metal bass players out there. So freaking Sound of White Noise, obviously my favorite album of the John Bush era. A lot of Anthrax were a little bit skeptical, if that's the right word, about this album because John Bush came from a band called Armored Saint, and Armored Saint is basically like one of those bands that, is good and was kind of. I don't really know much about Armored Saint, so there we go, I guess. But John Bush absolutely kills it on this album, and a lot of Anthrax fans were wondering, would Joey Belladonna would Joey Belladonna have worked on this album? That is a question that kind of needs to be answered, I guess, but whatever. It's freaking amazing. This album, it followed up, it kickstarted the John Bush era pretty darn good in my opinion, so lands here in the top 5, so there you go. Only's a freaking killer song. Go listen to it. Now we get into number 4, the 1990 album, and the final album of the Joey Belladonna era before worship music. We're talking about Persistence of Time. Now, this album does have Belly of the Beast, which is one of the greatest Anthrax songs of all time, freaking heavy. And of course, the Joe Jackson cover, Got the Time, which in my opinion should have been written by Anthrax. Because, for one thing, it's the song that got me into the band, so there's that. Joey Belladonna absolutely is freaking amazing on this album. What a way for him to go out and enjoy the absence of him until 2011, until the Big 4 tour and Sophia and all that jazz and, that stuff like that. So without further ado, number 4, Persistence of Time, Belly of the Beast, and Got the Time are both amazing songs on this album. Same thing with Blood and the song Time. And now we go to number 3 in 1988's State of Euphoria. Now, this album is kind of crapped on a lot, especially from the band and from fans. The band has basically said that this album felt like it wasn't finished, like it was rushed. They were trying to get an album out before going out on tour. But for me, this is a solid album. Be All End All is a really great song, one of the best Anthrax songs of all time. Make Me Laugh is kind of this thrash type of humorous. I mean, from the title alone, you can basically tell it's a funny song. But in my opinion, it's good. Make Me Laugh and Be All End All are definitely the 2 standout tracks on this album. For me, a lot of Anthrax fans would definitely have a lot more, or maybe even less, if they don't even like this album. But for me, I love this album. It's one of my favorite albums from 1988. So, with that all being said, State of Euphoria comes here at number 3. Now, this was a little bit tough, and this might be a little bit controversial here. But for me, I'm putting the 1987 classic metal album, Among the Frickin' Living, here at number 2. Now, this one falls short of the number 1 list is mainly because, some of the songs on this album, outside of the big hits, like the title track, Indians, Caught in a Mosh, let me see, all these great songs on this album, some of the songs here don't really connect with me, and plus the production's not really that great. Joey Belladonna's vocal production thing could have been turned down a little bit to make room for a little bit of the guitars and, maybe turn up the drums a little bit, I don't know. Even though it does have that nice 3-way punch between Indians, Among the Living, and Caught in a Mosh, this album basically just falls a little bit short of the number one list, mainly because Joey Belladonna doesn't really sound as good on this album as he does on the number one spot. So, without further ado, let's get into number one. Now, Process of Elimination. This is one of my favorite albums of all time. If you saw this landed at the number 8 spot. We're talking about the 1985 album, Spreading the Disease. Now, this is basically everything that the band did on Fistful of Metal, and they made it more heavier, I guess. They made it more clearer. Joey Belladonna is freaking killer on this. Frank Bello, this was the first album to feature him. He does a freaking amazing job. I mean, it opens up with freaking AIR, which is probably one of the best metal openers on a thrash album. I really love AIR. It's got the classic song Madhouse. My favorite Anthrax song is on this album too, which is Medusa. A lot of people don't really understand why Anthrax fans such as myself like Medusa, but that makes no freaking sense to me. I mean, Joey Belladonna shows off his range on both Medusa and AIR, and to me, that's what makes Joey Belladonna one of my all-time favorite metal vocalists. And I freaking love his style, I freaking love his range, and I freaking love his voice. So, without further ado, Spreading the Disease, at number one of my favorite albums of all time. So, there we go. And that concludes my Anthrax album rankings. Now, I know my facts weren't really that straight, mainly because, as I said, this is the big four band that, I go to the least. So I don't really know much about this band, but just try to bear in mind that this was basically just my opinion. But I love this band a lot, even though they're at the bottom of my big four totem. I love this band a lot, and I want to give a shout out to Old Head. He is a big Anthrax fan, and I just want to apologize for holding Anthrax down so low. Just know that I freaking love this band. I freaking love everything they did, specifically with the Joey Belladonna era and Sound of White Noise. Yeah. That will basically wrap up this video. Thank you so much for watching, my fellow YouTube divers. This is Water Eye 122 signing out, ready to dive into more fun on YouTube. Thanks for watching.